Good evening. Welcome to our Super City discussion. I am Paul Goldsmith, a trustee of Big Tent, and will be chairing this evening. Now, before we start, I'd like to thank Finn partners, Big Tent friends and patrons for your ongoing support. And of course, our expert speakers this evening. Membership at Big Tent is only £10 per month or £100 a year. And there are links in the chat below or via the Big Tent website. And one of the key benefits are our Meet the Leaders events. These are private roundtables. For example, yesterday, an excellent discussion we had with Jonathan Ruffer on what a coordinated response to regeneration looked like. And the next one we've got is with Alex Smith, who some of you may know. He's an Obama Fellow and CEO of Cares Family. And he's going to be leading a discussion around how we can make charitable giving and participation a norm and scale it and direct it to left behind people. And this is in keeping with the aim of Big Tent, which is to provide a collaborative, non-political forum from which positive proposals and plans can emerge and which we can support. And our focus is very much on regeneration and renewal. And I hope that is what most people would be able to share in terms of aims, even if people have got different ideas of how we get there. There are clearly many things which need to be done around the seas of connectivity, culture, community, confidence, capability. But a particular focus of the event this evening is around connectivity of people and how we can get a critical mass of population to create the opportunity and growth in northern areas. Now, COVID has taught us that in the future, hub and spoke working is going to be much more important. And then you've got 5G and FTTP offering great opportunities. But we're still going to need periodic commuting into major centres. So the focus tonight is on the transport aspects of rebalancing the country. Now, the event is going to last around an hour, the main event, and we aim for around half of this on general discussion. That's going to be recorded. And then after we have stopped the recording after an hour, we'll have a more informal discussion for those who can stay. So please use the chat throughout today's discussion, joining the live tweeting using the hashtag Big Tent. Now, our first panelist is George Freeman MP, who is one of the founders of Big Tent. And George actually has a long background in renewal and regeneration. I recently learned, beginning actually with a County Durham development project some 30 years ago, then worked in the life sciences startup space before joining Parliament. And one of George's great strengths is being able to pull disparate strands together with innovative thinking and really understanding people issues. He was First Minister for Life Sciences in the coalition government, then chair of the Prime Minister's Policy Board, and most recently, Minister for Decarbonisation and Digitisation at DfT before leaving the front bench about a year ago to focus on the politics of regeneration and renewal. George, over to you.
Paul, thank you very much. And to all of you for joining. There's some very distinguished and important people who are on the front line of this, and it's great to have you with us. Look, I'm going to try and say some provocative things to kick off a productive evening. And you've got after me two experts who can share real expertise in some very specific opportunities for the Northern Connectivity Challenge. But I just want to say some things about the context of it. And in case my internet connection goes down, I'll tell you what my three provocative thoughts are now, and then I'll expand them a bit. The first is that in the UK, slightly uniquely, we have a terrible track record of government delivering big infrastructure projects on time and in a way that connects properly, actually, and is owned by and leads to real long-term lasting regeneration. We tend to do them as very big top-down projects from London, which invariably in the UK have not gone well. And the Department of Transport, where I was until recently a minister, there's a whole number of issues for that which we could talk about and understand. The second point is that for that reason, and because real regeneration needs to be owned and led locally and drive an empowerment and a local economic sustainability, then to me, if we're going to make the infrastructure work to deliver that regeneration and renewal, then it's that way round. I want to suggest that we should be looking to do this in a different way, and Whitehall, the Treasury in London, giving the regions the power to plan and do their own infrastructure and raise their own global finance off the back of Treasury underwritten vehicles, so that the infrastructure is properly led locally. And thirdly, I want to suggest that if this is really, as it should be, about connectivity, then that can't just be one massive train line from the south to the north. It needs to be a broader vision about the connectivity east-west and north-south, and crucially, harnessing the sort of porteromics from Harvard of cities better connected, but also the communities that aren't in cities better connected to their local cities. A lot of the left behind areas are rural, as in County Durham, or coastal, and getting them decent links to a city is as important as connecting the big cities in the north up. Let me just say a little bit of background about where I'm coming from and why. So 15-year career before coming to Parliament in innovation, mainly biomedical, some clean tech and agri-tech, but background working to raise finance for early stage technology innovators, often academics, not always, and to take good ideas, scale them, raise money with the help of investors like some of the people on this call, and build sustainable long-term ventures. And that's what I spent 15 years doing, a lot of it around Cambridge, but not all of it. One of the projects was a 4-city, 4-university, 4-hospital project in Scotland, led by Scottish Enterprise, to put Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen together in a translational medicine research collaboration, for which we raised £100 million from Wyeth. And that gave me quite an insight into the power of connecting cities and connecting places. It also gave me a bit of an insight into Scottish politics, but that's a different point. And I just made this reflection that although in the life science sector, Oxford, Cambridge, London is the golden triangle, yes, and it's where a lot of the deep bioscience, the deep genomics, the molecular biology is. In the new landscape of 21st century drug discovery and medicine, it's much more about patient base, tissues, data, connecting populations, being able to find a population where you can do translational medicine and you can start to look at big data sets. And the north of England, the N8, those northern 8 universities, represent a phenomenal powerhouse in UK bioscience. I would go as far as to say, as I did as minister, that if Oxford, Cambridge and London is the golden triangle of sort of cellular science, then the N8 of the Northern Health Science Alliance is the potential powerhouse of population-based healthcare research, a genuine model of translational research with 22 odd million patients plugged into serious research hospitals. So the headline is that I think if we're really serious as a government, which we have to be rightly, about levelling up, that cannot and shouldn't just be about getting some hanging baskets in some marginal seats, so that the breakthrough MPs who've tapped into the frustration in the red wall areas can look busy and look credible. It should genuinely be about, as I think the Prime Minister is committed to, making a transformational change in the prospects, life chances and empowerment of that whole northern part of England. And HS2 is part of it, the connectivity between north and south. But my own view is that the connectivity of the north, within the north, and actually the connectivity of Scotland to the north to strengthen the union is as important as the connectivity between Birmingham and London. And I think it might be more powerful if we looked at it from the point of view of how to unleash and unlock the real power of that northern area of the country through connectivity. And when I went to DFT in 2019, the Prime Minister's remit to me, the second time a Prime Minister's created a new role for me, which I still not quite sure whether that's a compliment or an admission that my politics don't fit naturally into the traditional silos. But nonetheless, the brief was go to DFT, George, and help it go from being a sort of 1950s administrator of top-down contractual modal management to being a sort of NASA of 21st century mobility. And interestingly, within the DfT, there are many brilliant people frustrated by the very old-fashioned modal structure. You talk to people in the lift and they say, well, I'm in aviation, or I'm in shipping, or I'm in rail, or I'm in road. And my whole focus was on 3Ds: digitalization, decarbonisation, and disconnection, arguing that actually the DfT should be more in the business of places, of connecting places, and of thinking about the role of transport in unlocking the potential of places, rather than thinking of itself as a department for contracting for the pouring of concrete into very large pieces of infrastructure. And if you think about that, the department becomes much more about a department for connectivity, less a department for tier 1, 2, 3 procurement and contracting, which is how it is structured at the moment. And interestingly, of course, if we're going to deliver decarbonisation, we will have to start becoming much cleverer about tracking where people go and when and why, looking at the ways we can tangibly reduce carbon, putting low carbon apps into the pockets of commuters so they can start to reward them for taking a bus instead of a car, getting into road pricing. There's a whole revolution around place-based econometrics of transport and travel, which again, we won't deliver through a very top-down model of Whitehall looking at major infrastructure delivery. So it's a radical prescription, but I want to suggest, firstly, that the government should not consider itself the deliverer of this infrastructure. It should consider itself the architect of the framework of incentives, of freedoms, of abilities of regions and places to shape their own destiny. And that's a very, very different approach. And I'd like us to be allowing and incentivizing places to come together. How? Well, for example, if one took an approach and said to the northern cities, at the moment, between you all, you're wasting a lot of money with bad models of commuting, traffic, congestion, carbon, people sitting around achieving very little in traffic jams. If you could reduce that, it has a cost to the British economy. If you can reduce that, we'll give you some of the saving. And it's basically tax increment financing turned on its head. Allow the regions to drive UK PLC growth up on the promise that they can keep some of that dividend, and then allow the mayors to get together and raise a sort of northern infrastructure bond. The world is actually awash with capital looking for safe investments. There's a wall of money to go into infrastructure. And I think we could be allowing places like East Anglia, where my constituency is, or big cities or networks of cities to do something much more transformational than is currently planned, and to raise significant international finance to invest in whether it's a Greater Manchester or a Northern Connectivity Infrastructure Development Corporation, because connectivity actually creates value. By connecting places that are currently marginalized, you raise land value. And if you're able to capture that land value, then you're able to invest that back into better facilities. And my last point is, if one turns this telescope round and thinks not about London pouring concrete or London procuring other people to pour concrete, but think about allowing places to shape their destiny, then the connectivity is potentially north-south. If we think about Glasgow, Edinburgh, Newcastle, that link down, I mean, I think the government's got a real problem around the union at the moment, and investing in and showing that it'll support bold infrastructure to link the union actually could be quite powerful. Secondly, east-west is always neglected in the UK because of the shape of the island. It takes you sort of 3 hours to get from Yarmouth to Cambridge, which is why Yarmouth is very poor, and it takes you 40 minutes to get from Cambridge to London. We have this long tradition of vertical north-south infrastructure, and we've got to get into east-west infrastructure. And lastly, connectivity, ultimately, yes, there is really good econometric analysis that if you connect cities, you create more growth and you drive up significant economies of scale. but we've also got to think about the connectivity to the little places where most people live. And digital connectivity, it seems to me, goes hand in hand with road and rail and other forms of mobility. So I hope that's radical enough. It's a bold, radical call to decentralize the way we do it.
Thanks. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to mix some of the question and answer discussion in with the presentations. So before going on to Alan, because we've had some really interesting questions come through. And I wonder, George, whether you can touch on both of these, and then maybe Phil and Alan also in your talk. So one is from William Knight, board member, Earth Capital Asia, who is sort of seeing potential for Redcar, and it's a Teesside, which I think is one of currently the most desperate places in the country, most in need of support, where there's great hopes for sort of this green bio-green hub. And he's asking what needs to be done to attract scientific talent to the area. And I'm just wondering your reflections, given your journey in Cambridge from the 80s to what is now a sort of the UK powerhouse. And then the other question from Henry Hill was around, and it links to your sort of how do you get a local area to get a return on their risk? How would that interact with the devolution settlement?
Two great questions. I'll be quick. William, how do you attract scientists, technologists, and innovators to Teesside is absolutely fundamental question. And I just share this insight with you. The best definition of a cluster I've heard didn't come from an economist or from an academic. Actually, it came from an entrepreneur in Cambridge, Andy Richards, one of our leading life science entrepreneurs. And he said something very interesting to me once over a glass of wine as an aside. He said, a cluster actually needs to be defined in terms of family economics. It's a low risk place to move your family to pursue a career in a high risk sector. And ergo, Cambridge is a pretty low risk place to move your family actually to pursue a career in bioscience. I mean, if the company you join goes bust, there's 20 others you could join, and there's a fertile ecosystem of people recycling talent. But Aberdeen is quite a high risk place at the moment to take your family to pursue a biotech startup. And I think, William, part of your question goes to the heart of de-risking it. And I think Teesside has got a real opportunity to become a hub of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, of a really advanced approach to future fuels. And I think with the mayoral leadership being provided and the government support, I think it's happening. And I think if we could make places like Teesside hubs of something that they are genuinely good at, then you do reduce that risk and you start to build that cluster effect. Perhaps all of us on the call wouldn't want to go to Teesside, but those of us who are deeply interested, committed to, ambitious for whatever they're clustering in would go there. So I think focusing on some areas of expertise and de-risking is key, de-risking in terms of the cluster. And Henry, your point about, how one does this really, how does one galvanize the funding and the new models? I'm slightly obsessed, I confess, with the notion of local or regional development corporations. Often in Whitehall, we reinvent the wheel. Actually, the development corporation model has worked twice in its history when it was properly pushed. In the Letchworth and the early 30s models, it worked, and it worked in the late 80s in Docklands and in Liverpool with that Heseltine push for regeneration. And I'm a Heseltini on this one. I think that uniquely in Britain, we have a habit of central government announcing funds and stacking up funds. On regeneration, I've calculated we're at about 100 billion at the moment. Towns Fund, High Street Fund, Beaching Fund. I mean, funds coming out of our ears. And all they are actually is a Treasury announcement to put capital, ring fence it to be bidded for by places. But the little places, I mean, metro mayors are quite good at getting hold of the money. But the whole point about levelling up is that the little places that have been left behind struggle. I'd like us to unleash a new generation of local regeneration corporations, very simple, 10 years, compulsory purchase powers, land value capture gain powers, private funding freedoms, to buy up the seafront at Grimsby and develop it, and over 10 years start with hanging baskets and end up with train links, bus links, energy hubs. And I think that model is more likely to work than government top-down funds.
Super, thank you. Well, let's move on to our second panelist, Alan James. Dr. James is a leading expert on transport and infrastructure, but particularly green tech, electric vehicles and modern mobility. So your time has come. And his work focuses on how cities, regions and countries can gain strategic economic advantage through innovating in that infrastructure. Alan, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Could I just confirm that everybody can see a largely blue screen?
We can.
Yeah. So the thesis for this very quick canter through this is that revolutions in mobility enable massive economic growth. Yeah. A little bit of history is always instructive. In 1820, transport was still in the dark ages, and in 1830, Stephenson's rocket ignited the Industrial Revolution. And by 1930, the world had changed. It was a global network. And of course, those transformations have got faster ever since. In 1940, the jet engine, 1960, mass aviation, as an example. Mobility revolutions happen fast, and you've really got to keep your eye out for them. Here's an example. Fifth Avenue, New York, 1900. There is one petrol-powered car in that picture. Same place, 13 years later, eve of World War I, it's 100% gas-powered. Seen it coming. So, stress it. It happens fast, and there is a huge revolution in mobility happening right now, coming down the line at us. And we have the opportunity to do some pretty radical stuff by using the digitally enabled new technologies of mobility that are currently being developed. And I'll just look at a couple of them now. So here we have, top right, electric personal on-demand aviation, which is offering very flexible mobility from anywhere to anywhere where you've got a flat surface. Word to the wise, anybody who owns the top decks of multi-story car parks will suddenly find they have huge value. And on the left, you have Hyperloop, an idea originated by Elon Musk. Basically put a magnetically levitated vehicle in a low pressure tube, take all the air out of it, and it goes really, really fast because there's no resistance. Bottom left, the investable proposition from the States, which is Virgin Hyperloop. And the top, the investable proposition from the European Union, which is Heart Hyperloop. So the key thing to note about this is they're both real. They are both happening now. The technology is much closer to regulatory certification and approval than most folk think. And there are significant programs in play, both in the US and in the European Union, that are bringing these technologies from the innovation stage to commercial readiness. I'm going to focus for the purpose of this quick call on Hyperloop, which is 1,000 kilometers an hour, over 600 miles an hour in old money, and basically look at what does that mean if we applied it to the UK. I think what it means is that we can all stop talking about a northern powerhouse and we can actually build one. And what does that mean? So I think it means we have to unthink a lot of stuff. We have to forget today's paradigm, which is about slow transport between multiple cities. So if you take today's train, roughly 90 minutes from Liverpool to Leeds via Manchester, pretty wiggly. It has to go over the Pennines or through the middle, underneath the middle of it. And Northern Powerhouse Rail will be an incremental improvement on that. But don't think about multiple cities. Think about what happens if you apply radical connectivity to connect all of those places together, as George has indicated, not just the metro centres, but also the outlying centres. Create one super city. And I'm deliberately using the London transport graphics here to make the point. London is a world city. It's a global economy. It's the place that you live and work with reasonable certainty that you can get from one side to the other on functional transport that connects the Canary Wharfs with the Heathrows. It connects the West End with the places that you live. It connects the leisure and pleasure with the economics, all of that stuff. What does that mean if you apply it to London, to Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds? If you use Hyperloop, Liverpool to Manchester becomes a 5-minute trip, and Manchester to Leeds becomes a 6-minute trip. And from one end to the other, because all journeys on modern mobility, such as Hyperloop, are non-stop, it's 8 minutes from Liverpool to Leeds. Then we've got to Leeds, and we've been focused, a lot of the debate politically and policy terms has been focused on the Liverpool to Leeds section, particularly the Manchester to Leeds section. And everybody kind of thinks, okay, that's done the job. I'd argue don't half do the job, yeah. There's what I call the trot forgotten problem, which is the rest of the North gets forgotten often in this, which is the Newcastles, the Hulls, Grimsby was mentioned earlier as well, yeah. What if we did a proper job? What if we really got our teeth into this? Yeah. Liverpool to Leeds, as we've seen, 8 minutes non-stop. Further 8 minutes gets you from Mersey to Lumber. 14 minutes non-stop, one end to the other. Liverpool, Leeds, and then up to Newcastle. And you know, by the way a Hyperloop system architecture works, you would put offline terminal points in on Teesside and Wearside and other places where you want to create the clusters. 8 minutes, as we've seen, a further 13 minutes to Newcastle. The Mersey to the Tyne in 18 minutes. We're now creating a corridor of 15 million people. That's the same population as London. That's Greater London and a chunk of the southeast, I should say. That's about creating one labour market across a northern supercity. That's about combining the strengths of the N8, yeah, so that the brilliant universities turning out with great talent aren't turning out what I would call the success refugees who then have to go off to Silicon Valley or Hollywood to pursue what they're brilliant at. You've got the mega cluster here. And then ultimately, what about that trans-border link, linking east-west across the north of England into Scotland? Just taking the example here, 18 minutes Liverpool to Newcastle, a further 14 gets you to Edinburgh. Under half an hour from the capital of Scotland across the north to Liverpool. It's ambitious, yes, but not in that Whitehall sense of ambitious being a thing that you shouldn't do. It's ambitious in the sense that it transforms the economic geography of the country. And then, of course, the questions arise is how do you pay for it? And the answer is really quite simple. Don't think of this as subsidizing infrastructure. Think of it as investing in the innovation and specifically investing in the innovating companies that are making the core technologies that make all this happen, which is partly about mobility, but it's also predominantly about digital IoT, the control systems that give you real-time granular control over things moving at 1,000 kmh. If you invest in it early stage, you capture the technology uplift up front, and that is multi-X. I've been there and seen it. Yeah. And you use the uplift that you've created through technology investment to pay for the infrastructure. And I'll just conclude by putting an actual case of this on screen so that we get a sense of what that means. An object lesson in innovation investment. If we go back in ancient history to Tesla's market cap on the 8th of December last year, and it's significantly more than this now, you'll see the top line, over 600 billion, 700 billion now, versus the rest of the world's car industry. This is, of course, because Tesla's not being valued as a car company. It's being valued as an energy play, as an edge computing play, and as an autonomy play. You'd have to say then, well done to Daimler for taking a 10% stake in Tesla early on, which, had they held it until now, would be worth more than most of their competitors in the in the automotive industry. But they didn't. They sold it in 2014 for 6 rather than 61 billion. The message here is take a stake in the future and don't sell it too early. Get in, stay invested, capture the innovation uplift, and then you have created through investment, not subsidy, the capex that you can put into the infrastructure. And if you can do that, you can transform, you can innovate, and you can connect. And I think my message, having been in this space for 20 years and seen real progress now happening around the world in some of this, is let's make it happen here in the UK. We're actually pretty good at it. We invented transport in the first place. Let's reinvent it and remake the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. A very exciting vision. Now, our final panelist, Professor Phil Blythe, is Chief Scientific Advisor, Department for Transport and Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University. Now, your role at DFT is to independently challenge function and ensure that the policy making is underpinned by science and engineering. What are these new solutions really are going to be applicable for the challenges which we discussed about tonight? Phil, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and George was my boss for 2 years, really challenging us on the whole thing, and in particular on the 3Ds, which I think is really important. Thinking about tonight, the hypothesis today about having a critical mass of a region which incorporates both east and west of the Pennines and Scotland. That's a really interesting concept, to have a super region delivering a massive people, a massive economy to do things. And I think it's important to think in those terms because, as George suggested at the beginning, government has a very London-centric view of the UK, and certainly has a very London-centric view of what's needed for the transformation of transport. Whereas, in reality, the challenges are very place-based, they're very localized, and we really need to ensure that we understand that at the local level. That's why the combined authorities, the mayoral authorities are important. That's local politicians who understand the local region, understand the local problems, and can invest in the infrastructure and solve those problems with a vision for that region. I think that's what we could look at here. And key to that, obviously, is connectivity, and that's both electronic in terms of digital systems and connectivity underpinned by big data, machine learning and the like, better techniques to understand what's going on through all the sensing networks we have to really join a smart city together, optimize the decision making and really deliver all the elements what we would expect, well-being, health, transport, economy, commerce, energy, etc., and joining that to get there better. In parallel with that, obviously, that digital connectivity does one thing for us. It moves IP. It enables us to communicate and the like in a region. But we also need that physical connectivity. And to me, that's obviously transport and enabling mobility. And I see this in two ways, in a sense that one is we need to move people around and goods around the region to make that economy, to ensure that mobility between where the jobs are in the region and the like, but also delivering that national and international connectivity to the other regions of the UK and the other international powerhouses. And sometimes in the north, we don't do that very well. Certainly the east-west connectivity either side of the Pennines is appalling. It also seems crazy that the main link up the east coast for road is one single lane for part of that. We need to rethink what we can do, and we need to really think about how we can do it better. So the second part of thinking about transport is, we have great industries in the northern region, and in Scotland we have great SMEs, we have great innovators, and we have a really, really strong academic base within that super region. So we really need a vision of how we can design, build, deliver future transport solutions to improve regional mobility of both people and goods and those connections both nationally and worldwide. So we need to be ambitious about grasping the future opportunities of transport. And what are they? Well, we've heard one great example of Hyperloop. There's also really interesting other underground freight pipelines such as Mole and the like. Why do we have beautiful countryside and we put the people underground and in places like London and the freight above ground, for example? We need to look at decarbonisation. So electromobility is really, really important. You think about the capabilities we have in the north. We have Nissan, the major manufacturer of electric vehicles. We have the ambition of the other side of the Pennine and manufacturing. We have this potential of a new battery plant in Blythe to augment the only battery plant we have in the UK at the moment already in Sunderland. We have the investment in the key components for both electromobility and automation through the industrial strategy project Drive the Electric Revolution, which is building and researching next generation of electric drives and power electronics for that. Automation will come in many, many modes, whether it be on the road, whether it be for trains, for shipping, and ultimately for aviation as well. There's great work on that going on in the region. There's great expertise in the universities, in the SMEs, the IAMP industrial park being built around Nissan in Sunderland is being filled with companies in that space. We have the first opportunity to demonstrate ZEAL, zero emission automated logistics around Nissan in a big 5G project funded by DCMS, for example. And we also have great expertise in data across the universities with the National Innovation Centre for Data. I see Paul Watts on the call who heads that. The opportunity to bring all that transport and related data together and really deliver on optimizing how we do transport going into the future and providing that evidence and data to the politicians and the investors about what they should do. We think about the innovations needed in public transport, and boy, will we need public transport. If we're going to move towards decarbonisation, we need to persuade public that public transport is the way forward, more sustainable and decarbonised ways of transport, and that will replace the private car that we each individually own. Going back to the data point, having all that data and data connectivity, that opens up the new business models. So we won't need to own our car. We can share travel, we can share automated vehicles, which will do those journeys for us. We also need to look at the longer range travel and the opportunities that rail going forward will give us. We need that connectivity, whether it's through Hyperloop or High Speed 2 or other mechanisms. I think that's critically important. And I think also the opportunity to connect up those left behind places through the de-beachification of those railway lines that were closed down in the 60s. I think about Blythe in Northumberland, for example, opening up the Blythe-Ashington line. That will really open up the radius of economic opportunity for people in those communities, having access to the major cities where the employment is in places like Newcastle and Sunderland. And if we have that railway line starting at Blythe, we've got the renewable energy catapult bringing in megawatts of green electricity from the offshore renewables. Why not turn that into hydrogen something, have a new vector for our transport services in the north? And I'll come back to hydrogen in a minute. But what we need is to make sure that when we're building infrastructure now, we have a vision for the future. We make sure that our infrastructure, our stations, our transport, our energy systems are all there to be able to deliver the future of mobility, the future of transport. All those new services rely on electricity, rely on hydrogen, rely on data, rely on automation. And at the heart of that, we've got to forget, we mustn't forget, we've got to put the user. For so long in transport, we've designed transport systems because they suit the economists, they suit the politicians, they suit the service providers that want to provide trains. They'd love to run trains and buses without anybody on it because passengers are inconvenienced. We've got to make sure that we design our future transport systems with the user at the center, so we enable those users to really benefit from this great connectivity that a super region could have. And what I'd like to finish off with just talk about one of the aspects around that, which is around decarbonisation, the major climate change, the major emergency of our time, taking COVID out the equation for half an hour. We need to make sure that the northern region and Scotland really play a major role in delivering that. We have hydrogen hubs already up in Scotland and Aberdeen. We have some real ambition to introduce some hydrogen maritime operations off the Orkneys, and I'm funding the hydrogen transport hub at Teesside. These are real opportunities to learn how to bring new energy vectors into decarbonisation, something that transport's been very resistant of. But I truly believe we need to do that. And we're not just looking at it for heavy goods vehicles and buses where there's an obvious market, all the off-road vehicles. And bear in mind, in the north, we make a lot of off-road vehicles. We make a lot of the engines for those that need to be replaced from diesel to something else. So I think there's a real opportunity there. The hydrogen hub at Teesside will be a catalyst. Why not have another hydrogen spoke in Liverpool, where there's a lot of hydrogen going on, or in Blythe, and obviously the ambitions that already exist up in Scotland. They're running dust carts and other council vehicles on hydrogen in Glasgow, for example. Maritime is clearly going to go down the hydrogen route, so we need to make sure ports understand that, whether that's direct hydrogen or through ammonia. We're still looking at that within the DFT, and I think we're going to see electric flight and hydrogen flight. There's already been demonstrations of hydrogen planes, the Cranfield Zero Avia demonstration quite recently. Others are coming along, and as Alan said, we're not that far away, so we really need to think about how infrastructures in ports, airports and elsewhere, plus our infrastructure within cities, is designed to take into account that future of transport opportunity. And just to finish off, I'll just say that if you think about when the Prime Minister introduced his 10-point plan on the green recovery and the green industrial opportunities, hydrogen was there, electric vehicles are there, biofuels and synthetic fuels, particularly that could be produced from small modular nuclear reactors, which is an ambition of Rolls-Royce for aviation. There's a lot there, and this is where the new economy is, and this is where we need to make sure we have the skills, we have the jobs, and this is a region that can deliver that. And I think we've got a real challenge there, but we've got a massive opportunity if we can get our narrative right, and if we can reshape what we can achieve within the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Fantastic, really inspiring. Some great questions coming through in the chat. Several of them highlighting how important education is for regeneration, both to have good schools if you're going to move your family somewhere, but also upskilling adults. And of course, there are lots of things I said at the beginning that need to be done for regeneration, and I completely get that, but sort of trying to keep the focus of today's discussion on the transport aspects. There are three questions which are sort of linked, and I'd like to ask the people who opposed them maybe to speak. Joe Zamet-Lucia, John Beer, if he's on the line, and Namier and Razor, if I've got the pronunciation correct, which are all sort of linked in terms of how can we deliver that infrastructure effectively. Joe pointing out that we don't have a monopoly on failed infrastructure with Berlin Airport. So it's who does it? Who does the funding? I know we've talked about that a little bit already. And how do we get to the appropriate level of some things need to be planned at a broader level, and other things need to be co-produced by the locality to get sort of really good buy-in. So if you can take your questions along those lines. Joe, if you can unmute and pose yours.
Yes, so I think that massive infrastructure projects go wrong, and not just in the UK. They go wrong, it seems to me, more or less everywhere. And you know, it's to do with many things, as we know. It's difficult to get these things approved, done in a democracy where everybody has to have their say. You know, I mean, we only need to look at you know, the third runway at Heathrow and all the shenanigans around that. And then there's the, you know, it's actually difficult to build these things, especially today with all the technology that goes in them. So I'm wondering, as a question, whether it's more productive to believe that we can do it better, or whether it's more productive in our planning process to accept that they're going to go wrong. And something that's going to promise to be delivered in 10 years is likely to take 25. I just don't know the answer to that question, but I'm just wondering about, you know, where we get some degree of realism.
And John Beer, are you online? Are you able to unmute and?
Yep. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. One of the issues that we've got in rural areas is one of where the money comes from and how it's diluted to get projects on. So at the moment we've got LEPs, we've got county councils, we've got borough councils, we've got town councils. They're all political engines that basically, in our view, in rural areas, stop any vision and any movement. I mean, there's a situation we've got in Ely, and George knows this problem with the railway junctions. We spend millions on projects that are all run by local councils, but I think one of the areas is that we need to find a route down to the communities, and how we fund the communities, and actually the communities have vision. I think one thing that COVID has taught us, we're not resilient as a country. Communities have pulled us out of the mire more times than anything else, and unfortunately they probably get ignored when it comes to regeneration, putting effort in there. We, as I said yesterday, we run a community benefit society, which was set up by the Financial Conduct Authority, effectively for local people to invest in infrastructure projects. Now, what we are asking for is effectively government to actually match fund projects within those communities, rather than exactly going through the multi-dilutionary route through the LEPs to other organisations. So it actually goes to the point of need rather than actually hold back. So that's, as I say, power, energy, community energy. We were looking at, as Phil was saying, I work on with some people in Chester on their hydrogen projects, Peel ports with their hydrogen systems. And I think, it's one of those things. If in rural areas, if you have a Tesla car, you won't probably find a PowerPoint. And it's one of those things. It's not joined up, and it really needs to understand what rural living is all about, where the opportunity is for overseas investment in rural areas as well.
Okay, thank you. So I wondered whether, George, maybe you can come in first. Phil, I don't know whether your role at DFT also covers sort of the delivery side as well, in terms of how likely that is. And then I wonder, Mark Essex, could you be prepared to come in with your KPMG hat to answer some of those sort of funding and delivery questions? But George.
Yeah, two great questions, both linked. So Joe, I can't really comment on how bad other countries are at their infrastructure, but it's clear to me, as both a adult citizen of 30 years standing and a minister and MP of 10, that we are particularly bad. And I think there are various reasons. One is we do have a uniquely centralized political economy. I mean, across Europe, people do not envisage that, Lyon's planning system and transport system is run by Paris. It just isn't. And actually, Michael Heseltine's big regeneration report, No Stone Unturned, I think went to the heart of this. He argued that we are uniquely predisposed in the UK to launching, each different department launches different projects. And down on the ground in the community that is actually we're trying to help, it's almost impossible to access unless you've got a big metro mayor and a whole team of people who are professionals at accessing funds. But also we have very weirdly fragmented, duplicated power locally. So to John's point, I mean, I can talk for East Anglia, but I think it's true across the country. There is a lack of any agency that actually has the ability to do it. If we created a mayor for Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, I'm not declaring my candidacy here, but I probably would put my hat in the ring, because the real challenge in East Anglia, and I can see Robert Salisbury, I'd include Hertfordshire in a sort of big definition of these. Cambridge is a big driver of growth, but we should be ashamed that we've got deprivation in sort of Peterborough, Kings Lynn, Wisbech, Cromer, Yarmouth, Lowestoft. And the reason is the regional connectivity is so poor. And Ely Junction is one part of that. And 10 years I've been lobbying ministers, including having to lobby myself briefly. And the truth is that because infrastructure is done centrally, there is a capacity plan from London. We will deliver at this rate, and we won't change that rate of delivery. And I would allow an East Anglian mayor to go and raise the money to fund the Cambridge-Norwich Railway. I suspect if David Cleaveley and Herman Hauser and Robert and I and a few others went to the Middle East, we'd come back with 2 or 3 billion for a Cambridge infrastructure fund quite quickly. And you could convert all the railway stations into business incubators. There's huge land value gain. And you could create a Cambridge-Norwich Corridor Development Corporation. While you're at it, you build a new town at Lakenheath where they just shut the railway station. This isn't difficult, I don't think, if you've got the right leadership structure locally. And we seem to be very bad in this country at giving power away from London. And to me, that is the fundamental prerequisite for a proper programme of levelling up. Whitehall is going to have to give some power. And if taking back control meant anything, to me, it means not just from Brussels to Whitehall, but from Whitehall to communities. So I'd love every area to have a mayor. I think it would be very powerful, and we could cut through a lot of the multi-agency bureaucracy, but also the Treasury. It's very weird. They just don't accept that land value capture gain is a legitimate vehicle. They consider infrastructure bonds as public sector debt that sits on their balance sheet. And if it's going to sit on their balance sheet, they might as well control it. And my view is, listen, guys, money is cheap. It's leadership that's expensive. And by controlling and insisting that only Treasury money is the only money that'll be spent on infrastructure, you absolutely destroy any chance of any proper local leadership. So I think it is fundamentally about devolving from a rather top-heavy Whitehall.
Thank you. Phil, delivery side?
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure is a real challenge, and clearly TFT is the largest infrastructure builder in the UK. We recognise there's some significant problems and with delays and overruns. And what we've done quite recently is we've set up some new directorates within the DFT, which have a more systems engineering view, so they can actually look at the whole problem of infrastructure and how decisions are made. Also, some recommendations that we spend more time on that design phase rather than moving straight into building and really struggling with coming up with solutions that don't quite work. But also, I think, I've worked quite a lot in Europe on big infrastructure projects, and what I find is that there's a better partnership between the customer and the contractor before the contracts are signed. So they iron out a lot of things. So you're not having all these change contracts that add millions of extra money and massive delay to things. You're right, we just do it badly. We can do it better. We're good at building. We have some great construction companies, but putting it all together, I think we're really quite poor. On the other point about the localism and getting it down to that level, I'm a great believer in place-based solutions and making sure that the local community is involved. I live in a place called Whitley Bay on the coast up in the northeast. Yeah, we understand what our problems are. Nobody else does. So we need to have things down at that level. But then you still need the expertise to be able to deliver. And I think local authorities have been constrained in resources for so long. They've lost so much expertise, and much of the more technical stuff on delivery of transport and infrastructure is left to consultants who are around for that particular job, charge a particular price, which would probably higher than you would get from the local authority, and all the knowledge moves on with them. So you're never building up capability, and we need to move back from that. That's why I'm really pleased to see that many of the metro mayors are moving towards. I think that's critically important too.
Fantastic. Mark, I'm about to come to you, Mark Essex, but before I do, I want to put a question that's come through from Tony Nordberg, which is around thinking about the whole journey time, because it's not just the journey from as it is from when the plane takes off to when it lands. It's from when you leave your house to when you get back. And I think this is really important, because it's can you commute can you have your breakfast, go and have the meeting in Manchester, to go from London to Manchester and back in time to for tea. So making that close enough. So it's thinking about the entire journey, and is that being thought through in terms of the policy and plans? So Mark, perhaps some implementation and consultancy provision from you.
Yeah, I mean, I once pitched, by the way, exactly that point about end-to-end to Francis Maud. I said, if you're going to build a high-speed rail network that goes to Birmingham, why don't you put a national airport at the other end of it? And then get on the train at King's Cross, check in while you're on the train, arrive airside, and I reckon you can be in Birmingham faster than you can be in Heathrow now, especially airside. He said that's not mad, and yet they're still going to build a third runway in the most expensive real estate in the country. Who knows? On funding, I think it's really interesting what George says about centralising. Government does have a role to, as he says, to provide leadership and to de-risk investments. That wall of money, if you can convert an investment to look like a gilt, there's an absolute wall of money that would love to put it in. I mean, there's negative yields in Germany, right? They'd love to give their money to government projects if they de-risk them a bit. So if you are going to invest in a railway, government can reduce the risk of that investment by saying we won't build a road between the two places you're going to build a railway between. And that probably is worth 2p in the pound. So I think there's things government can do simply by making promises that people believe. I love the idea of land value capture. I have pitched a piece that goes nowhere because I think it's gets allergic reactions from Tories about putting capital gains on primary residence, so that when you build a railway between two places and everybody on that railway's house goes up, government gets 30% of the gain when those people eventually die and sell them. And you use that 30% to fund the thing. Goes down the hoop with people who already own property, as you can imagine. I think the other thing government can do is send a signal. When we did our Future of Towns piece, businesses would say, we love it when government builds a road because it shows that this place is going to be one of the winners. If I build my factory there, government spent money, they don't like cancelling big projects, and therefore it's probably going to be a good place for my factory to be in 10 years. Whereas if you build somewhere without any investment on the horizon, you don't know that government's not going to put the money in the next town. So government providing a signal and de-risking is really, really useful and doesn't actually have to cost anything. For me, the biggest pressure on centralisation comes from a phrase I'd like to ban, which is postcode lottery. It's that inherent sense of fairness or unfairness that means people, the vaccine provision gets delayed because some people are going too fast. But we never complain. If you live on the Isle of Skye, you can't get to a stroke facility in 8 minutes, but you see the stars at night. Swings and roundabouts, right? And you probably knew that when you moved to the Isle of Skye. I don't understand why we're trying to make everything standard everywhere. But I suspect it's very difficult to get people to accept variability in provision when they pay the same tax rate. It's quite hard.
Thanks, Mark. Alan, you're going to get the final 30 seconds before we end tonight's initial recorded session.
Okay, it's to Joe's question. Massive infrastructure frequently goes wrong. Should we not believe it from the beginning that it's just going to go wrong? Structurally, we do in the UK. We have a thing called optimism bias, which we build into the financial plans for any major infrastructure project. And lo and behold, the price goes up. Everybody then bids to the optimism bias inflated price. And if you come in under that, everybody celebrates that we've delivered under budget. We should be incentivizing it the other way around.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everybody for joining tonight's discussion. It's been very, very stimulating and insightful. And there are lots of questions still coming through and which I'd sort of like to go to. But we're going to sort of end the recording now because we've had our hour, and move for those that can stay on a little bit longer to a more informal chat. And I wonder, David Cleveley, if you're able to give your examples in terms of follow-up to Phil's points, if you're able to stay on. Roy, similarly, your Scottish comments, it would be great if you're able to stay on and share those. But thank you very, very much. And I hope we'll see you, as many as possible, at future Big Tent events.